Before I start, as we're in Canberra, I just sort of feel the need to declare that I have dual citizenship and that I have made no effort to either renounce or rescind that citizenship. Okay, so I'm Alison Reid. I'm from Curtin University in Western Australia, and I'll be talking about the health and exposure of migrant workers. So I'll briefly cover global migration, then I'll talk about the OH&S layers of vulnerability framework, talk about migration to Australia, and then I'll present 3 case studies of Australian experiences of migrant workers. So migration is a global phenomenon. In 2016, there were an estimated 244 million international migrants. This represents 3% of the world's population. And it's roughly equal numbers of men and women. Most migrants emigrate from one developing country to another developing country rather than a developing country to the developed country. 2015 saw the greatest number of forced displacement since the end of the Second World War at 16.5 million migrants, refugees rather, and half of these were from Syria. So the biggest driver for migration is work, and both males and females, migrants, have much higher labour force participation than the native-born population to the country that they migrate to. For many, the work is still hazardous, and males tend to do the dirty, dangerous and difficult jobs, as Mahendra said, but for women it's largely occupations in cooking, cleaning and caring. Most of what we know about the occupational health and safety of migrant workers comes from the international literature, and most of that work has focused on safety rather than on exposure to occupational hazards. A lot of countries, including the United States and many Northern European countries, have shown that work-related injuries and fatalities are greater among migrant populations than their native-born populations. Specifically in the United States between 1980 and 1996, when overall work-related fatalities declined by more than 45% among all workers in the US, they increased in that period among foreign-born workers, particularly those who had an Hispanic or a Latino background. Much less work has been done looking at exposure to chemicals or carcinogens among migrant workers. It's a much understudied field. So one way of thinking about disparities in occupational health and safety, why they may exist between migrants and the native-born populations, is the OH&S layers of vulnerability framework. This considers the heterogeneity both of the migrants themselves and of migrant work, and so it gives us a capacity to look at and examine various risk factors so to identify which groups might be at greater risk of experiencing work hazards. So the vulnerability framework looks at 3 layers of vulnerability. And the first one is those layers that are related to the process of migration. So specifically, migration security and visa status. So undocumented workers who have no rights in the country they have migrated to are most vulnerable. But also vulnerable are those workers whose right of stay in their country might be contingent on the goodwill or good opinion of one employer. The next layer of vulnerability are risk factors specific to the migrant worker. So for example, a migrant who has poor education or low skills might never have received any occupational health and safety training, might be unaware of their occupational health and safety rights and entitlements, and might have less control over the demands placed on them at work. The third layer of vulnerability relates to those factors specific to the receiving country. It has things to do with like the industrial sector that the migrants might be employed in, or the socio-economic conditions of the receiving country. So migrants who experience these risk factors It therefore, or workers who experience these risk factors, it therefore impacts on their capacity to realise their occupational health and safety rights, to say no to working in hazardous jobs, to complain about poor working conditions, or to seek legal protection. And so the greater number of these risk factors that any worker experiences, the more likely they are to experience exposure to a hazard at work or to incur a work-related injury. So, as I said before, most of what we know about the occupational health and safety of migrant workers concerns safety rather than occupational health. There has been a little bit of work done, mainly from the United States and Spain, but it's been rather difficult in the United States to compare the conditions of migrant workers and native-born workers, and that's because they largely work in very different sectors of the labour force. However, some work from the United States has shown that migrant workers have greater exposure to chemicals and pesticides and other hazards. Work from Spain similarly has shown that migrants have higher exposure to dusts and fumes and gases than native-born workers, but that was based on self-report data and was not measured at all. But what about Australia? So we are a nation of migrants, 1 in 4 is born overseas. What's happening with the occupational health and safety of our migrant populations? So just to recap, to remind you about migration to Australia, between the end of the World War II, 1945, and the mid-1970s, Australia received more than 6 million migrants, largely from the United Kingdom and Northern and Southern Europe, and these workers came to build our manufacturing and industrial and infrastructure base. It was largely permanent migration. They came to settle in Australia and to build their lives in Australia. From the mid-1990s, we've focused on skilled migration, and since 2008, 2/3 of all visas issued have been to skilled migrants. These workers come from more than 180 countries, and today, they're mostly from China, India, South Africa, and the United Kingdom. And a reasonably recent phenomenon in Australian migration is temporary migration. Until the mid-1970s, even mid-1980s, we had mostly permanent migration, but nowadays we have a lot of temporary migration, and in 2016 we had 1.2 million workers in Australia who were here on some form of temporary visa. The important thing to remember about a temporary visa is that they can go on to become permanent migrants in Australia, but they need to get secure the good opinion of their employer, who's then integral to their migration process. So their right of stay in Australia is contingent on the goodwill of one employer. So at the same time that Australia was experiencing its migration boom, we were also mining asbestos, we were importing manufactured asbestos cement products and our raw asbestos, and we were manufacturing our own asbestos cement products. Every capital city had its own asbestos cement factory. In the 1950s, we were the largest consumer of asbestos globally per capita. We used asbestos cement sheeting largely in construction and manufacturing, and 25% of all new housing built between 1946 and the 1960s was clad in asbestos cement, and more than 70% of all housing has some form of asbestos in it. Another facet of the migration program to Australia was the assisted passage scheme. So this started in 1945 as a bilateral agreement with the Australian government and with the governments of the United Kingdom, Italy, West Germany, and the Netherlands. So this facilitated their migration to Australia, and you've probably heard of the £10 POM scheme. So that was the scheme with the United Kingdom. So the condition when these workers arrived in Australia, they had to work in government-employed or government-approved jobs for a minimum of 2 years, and then that secured their permanent migration to Australia. However, that employment, as we were developing and building our infrastructure, was largely labour-intensive work. So these workers were employed in building and construction, automotive components, airways, shipping, mining, redevelopment and construction projects. So labour-intensive work. So this leads me on to the first case study. You've probably all heard of Wittenoom. It was a blue asbestos mining and milling operation located in the remote Pilbara region of Western Australia. It operated between 1943 and 1966, so those peak migration periods. It was notoriously dirty. This is the mill. You can see the Hessian bags there that were used to transport the asbestos. They were ruled out in 1931 in Britain for use of transporting asbestos, which was 12 years before the Wittenoom operation started. The mine, very narrow stopes, so hard working conditions. So Australian miners did not like working at Wittenoom. They were used to full headroom, and the stope height at Wittenoom was 42 inches or 107 centimetres. So that, and combined with the poor living and working conditions, really ensured a high workforce turnover. So the company, Australian Blue Asbestos, had to rely on migrant labour. So the Italians were the largest cohort of workers brought to Wittenoom as part of an assisted passage scheme, and there were more than 52 nationalities of workers throughout the lifetime of the mine and the mill. Sorry, just bear with me. So, as I said, many of the Italians came to Wittenoom on the assisted passage scheme. One condition of the Italian assisted passage scheme was that workers had to be under 35, unmarried and unskilled. So this placed them in a precarious position at Wittenoom. They largely tended to work in the mill, which required unskilled labour, but turned out to be one of the most dangerous places to work at Wittenoom. Also, many of them were indebted to the company on their arrival at Wittenoom, so to try and pay off these debts, they would work double shifts, thus increasing their exposure. They were also shorter in stature than the Australian workers, so many were sent into the mill because of the narrow stopes. It was felt it was easier for them to work in there than the native-born workers. So this graph shows the cumulative exposure measured in fibre per mil years. The blue column represents the Australian and British workers. We couldn't separate the Australians and the British when we looked at this, because in that day, many Australians identified as being British. So the blue bars are the Australian workers, the y-axis is percent. The reddy orange bars are the Italian workers, and they're the Italians who stayed in Australia. And the grey bars are also Italian workers, but they're the ones that returned home many years later. We have a colleague in Venice who follows up the Italians that returned to Italy. So this first column on the left, it's your left too, is the exposure limit is less than 10 fibre per mil year. So you can clearly see that most of the Australians and British born are in that lower exposure category. And then as we go further to the right and as exposure increases, we can see that more Italians are represented in those other categories. So clearly the Italians received greater exposure to blue asbestos at Wittenoom than the Australian and UK group. So how has that translated into mesothelioma rates? Well, the Australian rate is 128 per 100,000, which is very large, but the Italian rate is 184 per 100,000, so considerably larger than the mesothelioma rate for the Australian born. And in terms of risk, this is the hazard ratio, so the Italians had a greater than twofold risk of mesothelioma from working at Wittenoom. So this then got us thinking about, well, what about all the other migrants that arrived in Australia during those peak migrant booming periods, but also peak asbestos periods. How have they fared in terms of mesothelioma? So we looked at national death records between 1981 and 2012. We obtained a denominator from every census from 1981 up to 2011. The census wouldn't release some countries separately because numbers were too small, so we had to aggregate up to regions of birth for some of our countries. And we compared mesothelioma mortality rates by country of birth with the Australian born. So this table shows Australia with 1 at the top, and then the next 3 countries are the UK and Ireland, Italy and Germany. They all had significantly higher risks of dying from malignant mesothelioma than the Australian-born population. And then at the bottom of that table, you can see there's countries in blue. They all had significantly lower risks of dying from malignant mesothelioma than the Australian-born. And it's very interesting to note that those countries at the bottom were more likely to have arrived in Australia after Australia ended the White Australia policy, which is the mid-1970s, and after we had gone through our peak period of asbestos use. But this is, okay, so if we want to think about why these disparities might have occurred in terms of the layers of vulnerability framework, well, the factors related to migration, it was the assisted passage scheme. It's directly sent Italians to Wittnoom. Wittnoom was a Commonwealth-approved employment, and it placed other migrants in jobs where they incurred potential asbestos exposure. The factors related to migration, the Italian scheme directly facilitated unskilled, unmarried and young males, which led to their greater profusion of working at the mine and at the mill and in the mine at Wittnoom, in the more hazardous jobs. And in terms of factors related to the receiving country, these migrants arrived at a time when Australia was going through its development phase and high asbestos use. But the diseases I've shown you, mesothelioma has a long latency period, 30, 40, 50, even 60 years. So this exposure occurred a long time ago. So Australia's moved on and we've progressed, and this isn't likely to happen recently, is it? So in 2013, we conducted a national telephone survey to look at exposure to workplace carcinogens among ethnic minority workers. So our participants were Arabic, Vietnamese or Chinese ancestry. They could be born in Australia or born elsewhere. The criteria was that they had to be currently employed and living in Sydney, Melbourne or Perth. We got 750 people of roughly equal numbers. So we did a telephone interview, as I said, and participants could be interviewed in English or in Arabic, Mandarin, Cantonese or Vietnamese. We asked their job title and then we asked what tasks they do in their current job. And from that information, they were determined as being unexposed or possibly or probably exposed to a predetermined list of 38 carcinogens. So such things as metals or dusts, including asbestos, radiation, solar and ionising, combustion products and other agents such as benzene and shift work. So we found overall there was a 32% prevalence of exposure in 2013 to workplace carcinogens among these ethnic minority workers. Men were more likely to be exposed than women, and Arabs had the highest exposure compared with the other two groups. For men, the most common exposures were solar radiation, environmental tobacco smoke, diesel engine exhaust and silica. And for women, it was solar radiation, environmental tobacco smoke, other PAHs and ionising radiation. When we look at the prevalence of exposure by the language they chose to be interviewed in, the brown bars represent those who were interviewed in English, and the dark blue bars are those who interviewed in a language other than English, so Arabic, Mandarin, Cantonese or Vietnamese. So from this graph, we can clearly see that if you interviewed in a language other than English, you were much more likely to be exposed to at least one carcinogen in your work. We conducted exactly the same survey among Australian workers the year before. The only difference with that survey and the one we did for the ethnic minority workers was that the ethnic minority workers could be interviewed in languages other than English. So we used the data we obtained from that survey conducted in 2012 to compare the results of exposure with our ethnic minority workers. So from that earlier survey, there were 5,000 workers interviewed, and then to compare with the ethnic minority workers, we only looked at those who were residing in Sydney, Melbourne or Perth. So this table shows the prevalence of exposure or the risk of exposure to any carcinogen or at least one carcinogen. So you can, I don't know how this works. I'll talk you through it. So the first row shows percent. So you can see for Australian-born workers, almost 30% were exposed to a carcinogen at work in 2012. So it was very similar to all the migrants, all the ethnic minority workers together. Although we can clearly see that Arabic-speaking workers had a much higher risk of being exposed, a much higher prevalence of exposure. In terms of risk, we can see that 23% there was a 23% increased risk among Arabic-speaking workers compared with Australian-born workers for exposure to any carcinogen. But when we adjusted for occupation, that increased risk attenuated. So what that's telling us is that the Arabs were working in different jobs to the Australian-born, and that's why they had different exposure. So here we're looking at the same thing, but we're looking at a range of carcinogens. So the first row you can see solar UVR, and Arabs had a 33% increased risk of exposure to solar UVR than the Australian-born. So all those numbers that are greater than 1 and that are in bold show that the ethnic minority workers had a greater risk of exposure than the Australian-born workers to that carcinogen. Where it's less than 1 and in bold, they had a significantly lower risk of exposure than the Australian-born workers. So if I talk you through solar UVR again, the Arabs had a 33% increased risk of exposure to solar UVR than Australian-born workers. Similarly, a greater risk of exposure to diesel than Australian-born workers. But when we adjust for occupation, these risks attenuated. And as I said before, they were working in different jobs, so there's some segmentation of the labour force happening among ethnic minority workers and Australian-born workers. So we found that ethnic minority workers were more likely to work as drivers or in construction and painting, whereas so that's explained their exposure to the solar UVR. So when we adjust for occupation, some of the differences in exposure do remain. So what this is telling us is that even when the ethnic minority workers and the Australian-born workers are working very similar jobs, the ethnic minority workers might be doing the dirtier tasks. So if we look at silica, it's a standout in terms of the ethnic minority workers and the Arabic and the Vietnamese workers have a much higher risk of exposure to silica than Australian-born workers. So we looked at this in terms of construction workers because it was them that were exposed to silica in our study, and we found that there was differences in tasks. So the ethnic minority workers were more likely to sweep and dust, to cut tiles, to plaster, and to file tiles, whereas the Australian-born workers were more likely to mix cement and to work with concrete. So that explains in the when you look at within occupations, there are differences within the tasks that ethnic minority workers and Australian-born workers do, and that explains the differences in that exposure. So if we think again about why these disparities might have occurred in terms of the layers of vulnerability framework, think about layer 2, the factors related to the migrant. We saw that English language proficiency, if you didn't speak English for the interview, you had a much higher prevalence of exposure. And then if we think about factors related to the receiving country, we can see that there's some job segmentation going on in Australia, and that more ethnic minority workers work as drivers and construction workers, and also food service workers. And there was also some segmentation of tasks, wherein if an ethnic minority worker and an Australian-born worker were doing the same occupation, they were doing different tasks within that occupation, and that explained their differential exposure. So, as I described, migration is a global phenomenon, and it's increasing, and the biggest driver for migration is work. And work for migrants is heterogeneous, and for many it's still hazardous. And in order to prevent future disparities in mortality, we need to prevent disparities in exposure now. Thank you.